Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's just fantastic to be in Chicago. I got to take this off. I'm Jim Glassman, and I'm the executive director of the George W. Bush Institute. I'd just like to acknowledge a few people here today. Mark Langdale, from whom you're going to hear a little bit later, who is the president of the George W. Bush Foundation, sitting in the front row. Margaret Spellings, from whom you're also going to hear, who is the chair of the Bush Institute's Education Advisory Board. And Margaret was, of course, the former Secretary of Education. And also Eddie Lazier, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the George W. Bush Institute Advisory Board. Also like to thank our sponsors, the Illinois Policy Institute, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Highland Capital, and First Trust. And also special thanks to Byron Trott. The Bush Institute is the policy innovation arm of the George W. Bush Center, which also includes a library and museum. And the Bush Center has been under construction in Dallas for nearly 2 years now, on 24 acres of the campus of Southern Methodist University. And it's almost done. It's a gorgeous building designed by Robert A.M. Stern, and we hope you'll all join us at the dedication in April of next year. Now, even though we don't have a building yet, the Bush Institute has been up and running now for the past 3 years. Here's some of the things that we've been doing. We lead a partnership that's saving women from dying of cervical cancer and breast cancer in Africa. We've launched an amazing online archive of video interviews with dissidents and freedom advocates, including the late Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, the Dalai Lama, and many others. And what we're doing is sending their stories and providing moral support to dissidents working for freedom today in such places as Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba. We're also reforming education by building a network of thousands of schools that, with our help, are transforming leadership, specifically school principals. We're also working in middle schools, and in 2 separate programs, we're seeking to get more bang out of the taxpayers' bucks. That is, more productivity from teachers and administrators and more accountability. And if that sounds familiar here in Chicago, it should, and it's not just happening in Chicago, it's happening around the world. And I'm sure Margaret will have a word or two to say about that. We've launched a Women's Institute that brings women of the Middle East to the United States, that trains them and mentors them and sends them back home to build networks and create a strong base for civil society. And with our military service initiative, we're helping veterans and their families. And along with that, just next week in Dallas, we'll be holding our 2nd golf tournament for wounded warriors. And in everything we do, we're inspired and guided by the passion of President Bush and Mrs. Bush, and by the principles that they have lived. Principles like freedom is universal, and to whom much is given, much is required. One of those principles is free markets and free enterprise create prosperity and opportunity. And that's the basis of the 4% Growth Project, which was launched just last year. The idea is to find ways for America to grow at 4%, sustainable, real GDP, not 2%, which we've got now, even though we're supposed to be in a recovery, and not even 3%, which is our post-World War II average. We think America can grow at 4%. In July, Crown published the Institute's first book, The 4% Solution, with a foreword by President Bush and 21 chapters by academic and business experts, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, Two of them, Robert Lucas and Gary Becker, from the University of Chicago. We suspect that tax policy offers the most leverage in boosting growth, and that's one of the reasons that we're here. Amity Schlaze will explain the rest. Amity Schlaze is a Chicago native. She's a senior fellow at the George W. Bush Institute and director of the 4% Growth Project. She joined the Bush Institute from the Council of Economic Advisors, from the Council on Foreign Relations. Someday she'll be at the Council of Economic Advisors. She's written 3 books, most recently The Forgotten Man, her revisionist history of the Great Depression, with tremendous resonance today. I just last week heard Rand Paul talking about the book on the ABC Sunday show. And her new biography of Calvin Coolidge will be out in a few months. Amity Schlaze.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. We at the Bush Institute can't think of a place we'd rather come than here. Economic growth is the subject of our work, and there's no more appropriate place to talk about growth than Chicago, which is a city made from trade. It was long the avatar for American growth. Later today, we're going to move into the stock exchange room, which is a reproduction of the old real stock exchange, Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan's room. When that room was built in the 1890s, Illinois' population, Chicago's population, grew 54% just in those few years. And the growth of Chicago in that period was so fast they had trouble quantifying it. Mark Twain said about the growth of Chicago in that period, it is hopeless for the occasional visitor to try to keep up with Chicago. She outgrows prophecies faster than they can be made. Chicago was so dynamic in that period, the world admired it. So we're here to open an inquiry. What about growth now? This conference was planned well before the current teachers' strike, but the strike just reminds us why we need such a conference. Our own project is about faster growth. The reason the strike is so bitter, the reason we're in the second week of the strike is that we don't have fast growth. We have slow growth in Chicago, so people are fighting over a small pie. We're glad to have joining us in this inquiry the growth-oriented Illinois Policy Institute as our local partner, and to have our other partners who Jim mentioned, among them U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Secretary Spellings. First Trust Advisors, Brian Wesbury will be speaking. Byron Trott will be introducing at lunch, and so on. The nature of our inquiry couldn't be simpler, I want to say. It is to look at growth and tax policy. We had a first conference in New York earlier this year and set up our method. We ask, unlike other conferences, who's growing? Who's growing? And then we say, working backwards, what is their tax policy? So we're here now to look specifically at the Midwest. Fortunately, the United States is a lab with states and towns as test tubes. We see it, it's a natural experiment. In the spring, we looked nationally. Now we're getting granular. In our first session this morning, we're going to hear from policy experts across the Midwest. Then in the next session, we're going to get real from business leaders themselves. Next, we have a special breakout with David Booth, who gave so much to the University of Chicago. David will have a frank discussion with Jim Glassman about what a business life is like, why you move, where tax or other business factors fit into that, and that will be extraordinary. And I'm hoping Eddie Lazier will ask a question there too, because he's part of this story. Chicago's not just an economic city, it's a trade city, as I wrote in an op-ed in the Trib this morning. It's a transacting city, so we've dedicated a special session to just Chicago as trading place. And finally, over lunch, we're going to have a special treat here from Governor Mitch Daniels about the Hoosier learning curve, what Indiana has learned through its own experience of trying to chase growth. And introducing that governor will be both Mr. Trott and Ambassador Langdale, our leader at the Bush Center. Just a couple words more. What makes people come to a city? What makes people not come? That's what we'll be looking at. Is Chicago a city where a stranger can come? Is it transparent enough, or is it still the old daily city that I grew up in, a city of deals rather than prices? That's one of the things we'll be asking. A second focus, most people or many people assume that policy doesn't matter, that a federal or a state policy it is what it is, like weather, that you can raise or lower tax rates and nothing will happen. If there is one thing you take away from our work this morning, it is that policy matters. Businesses aren't just sensitive to policy, to tax rates, to regulation. They are exquisitely sensitive. So we're going to try to capture that sensitivity and demonstrate it. States and towns are in perpetual competition with one another, whether we acknowledge it or not. Those of us who are from Chicago would like to say we have no doubt Chicago can prevail in competition, especially if the city recalls and returns to its strength, which is as a trading place, a trading center, a place of transaction. I remember a quote from Carl Sandburg, who said, "The city is so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, a ferocious competitor." And we have all hope for it. To launch the first discussion, the first round on Midwest competition is a man I view as a competitor himself, John Tillman, Chief Executive Officer of the Illinois Policy Institute. When those of us not from here look at Chicago, one of the figures who stands out is John and what he's done with the Institute now in its 10th year. You've seen John's name all over the teachers' strike, and with him will be his excellent colleagues, Ted Dabrowski, Kristina Rasmussen, and Matt Denhart from our own Bush Center, as well as Mr. Hicks from Indiana. I'd just say one word about John's bio. He was an entrepreneur himself. He's had failure companies and somewhat successful companies and very successful companies. One was a public internet access kiosk company. Another had to do with sports and retail. John is the winner of the Thomas Rowe Award for his leadership in nonprofit work, which is very prestigious in our circles. That what he does means something to Chicago and to all of us who are working in policy. May I welcome John Tillman.
I've noticed that I hope the mic is on. I've noticed that our seats are a little low. If you're in the back and want to move forward to some of these empty seats, feel free if you cannot see, but have a chair panel. I'm often asked if it's something in the water in Illinois that makes us have such bad public policies. And unfortunately, the answer is true. That is why all of us have bottled water, and we will be using this during the course of this panel to try to keep us on the mark. I'm struck by the idea of tax rates because I live it every day. I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I've noticed the marginal reaction she has when her allowance went from $5 to $10. The level of productivity I got out of her has increased dramatically. I no longer take out the garbage. I no longer have to clean the bathroom we share, and given that she's a 13-year-old girl, this is an excellent thing. So I think these are the kind of things that happen in everyday life. Yet, Mike Hicks, where are you? There you are. There are many people who don't think tax policy matters. You're at Ball State University. You're running the whole economics area there. You study this every day. You live in Indiana, a state where massive public policy changes have been put into place. Does tax policy matter?
Unambiguously, yes. Tax policies, both at the state level and the local level, matter for business location decisions. They're combined with the level of public service provision as well, but certainly taxes overall as a way of expressing cost of business and a commitment to a community to economic growth are an important part of what state and local leaders are going to have to do to move us to a 4% growth.
Now, Governor Daniels is well renowned, especially in groups like this, for having reformed the public policy scheme, if you will, of Indiana. Is it working?
I think so. Governor Daniels will say unambiguously yes today. I think there are a couple of things that I'd like to say that I don't think the governor will talk about is the role of reducing or reining in what I call a shadow tax or unfunded liabilities that are going to weigh so heavily into discussion today and are a great experiential difference between the state we're in now and the state that you could be in just a few minutes east of here if you elected to move there. I think also the quality of public services that the governor has managed to improve. And so he's pulled off a real trifecta. And it's not just simply reducing tax rates and reducing the size of government, but actually increasing the responsiveness of government, be it in higher education, the most massive educational reforms, or if you go to Indiana's Bureau of Motor Vehicles, it's like a fast food restaurant. If you pass the driver's test, I didn't, so I had to go back. But it really, they time you coming in and out, and it's a very fast experience. And I think, those are the things that residents and business leaders care an awful lot about, and I think that's, I hope, what we explore today.
Now, before we move on to some of the other panelists, I do have a question I need to ask you that I've been dying to ask somebody of your stature. After all, you're director, of the Center for Business and Economic Research, professor of economics at Ball State University. I'm always fascinated by the economists who seem to think that nobody in the real world responds to incentives. I'm just curious, have you ever seen any professors at the university respond to higher offers of pay to go to another university or to come to Ball State?
Right. I mean, I know you're targeting one professor, but I think that's a fairly common. Look, there's really not much debate amongst academic economists about the role of tax policy. The questions are, where has this worked empirically? How have the balance of the role of the provision of public services mattered? And I think we're beginning to see some of it from the Booth School, really important research about uncertainty in tax and regulatory policy and how that's playing into growth. So it's not simply whether or not we're seeing growth or we're seeing low taxes, but how is uncertainty playing into that? And I'm talking about bad uncertainty. And I think the things like a shadow tax, many people will be astonished. The unfunded liability for the city of Chicago is about $36,000 per resident. Right? It's about $1,800 per resident in Indiana. That's bad enough. But what the governor will say today is we pulled our bond ratings up. And so that, for people who understand that, that's important. I always wish he would say, yeah, but that means that local governments can borrow more cheaply to improve their infrastructure, to build a new school building. And so it's really that shadow tax, the role of tax policy, and uncertainty about what's going to happen to your investment that are making differences about where business is located.
Matthew Denhart, the research associate from the Bush Institute. So you're from Texas.
I'm from Ohio, actually, but I work for the Bush Center, which is based in Texas. But to complicate it, I'm actually in New York.
Well, that is very, very complicated. But nevertheless, you're familiar with Texas. And I think it's very interesting that Amity mentioned that the Bush Institute has been underway for 2 years. So this is actually a shovel-ready program, the Bush Institute.
That's right. It's shovel-ready, and it's actually, I understand it's on time and under budget. So.
Well, I'm guessing that that's because it's probably all privately funded, or at least it darn well better be for the most part. No need to dive into that in depth here today. So tell us a little bit about the innovation work that you're doing and what you're discovering at the Bush Institute around the country, and what are the pathways you see that states can focus on from a tax policy point of view in terms of changing policy to have more innovation state by state?
Yeah, so as Amity mentioned, to kick off this entire event, what we look at and what we like to look at is outcomes, and that's sort of in President Bush's style as well. So we look at who's growing, and then we work backwards and we ask, what are the tax policies in those places? So I guess a logical place to start for this conference is who is growing. And if you look at the states with the highest growth, the actual state with the absolute highest growth in recent times has been North Dakota. And that's a bit of a distraction because their growth has been from the discovery of shale. But we're the 4% growth project. They've been growing at about 8% a year, save 2008 when the financial crisis hit. But another way to look at it in a policy sense is to separate the states there are 9 states with no state income tax. And then if you compare those to the 9 states with the highest state income tax, how does growth differ? And Art Laffer, sort of the father of supply side economics, and Steve Moore at the Wall Street Journal, and Jonathan Williams have published a great book. It's, I think, in its 5th year. It's called Rich States, Poor States. It's put out by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. I recommend it to anyone here who's interested in these topics. You'll find a lot more data. But what we find is that the 9 states without the state income tax over the last decade had growth of 59% versus 42% for the states with the highest taxes. If you want to look at employment, the no income tax states grew about 5%. The high tax states, actually, employment shrunk. If you look at population, people vote with their feet. They go where there are opportunities. They go where they think their skills can be maximized. And what we see is the no income tax states had population growth of almost 14%, while it was only around 5.5% for the states with the highest taxes. And then something that we often hear is, well, if you lower tax rates, then you're going to have less income for the state. You can do less. Public services will decline. States are already having budget problems. And so that'll, how can you possibly lower taxes? What we find is actually state and local revenues, government revenues from taxes, often increase when you lower the rates because of the growth effect. When you have a larger pie to tax, what you find is that taxes increase. And so if you look at that last decade, what Moore and Laffer found is that state and local revenues for the no income tax states grew 81%, while only 45% for the states with the highest taxes. So it's counterintuitive, but I think it's really instructive.
Well, that goes to the essence, Matt, of the supply side argument, that if overall tax burdens are lower, the pie grows faster, people produce more, and they throw off more tax revenue without raising rates. The other people on the other side, those folks, you're familiar with those folks on the other side?
I've met them.
They think that the way to get revenues to grow is by raising rates versus lowering tax burdens and improving GDP growth and hitting 4% and beyond. Why are they wrong? Why are they in denial? I mean, the name of this panel is Tax Denial and Tax Survival. Why are our opponents, the worthy ones on the other side, in denial? Let's start with the president and work our way down to our governor and our mayor.
Well, you know as well as anyone, that's why we're here in Illinois, because of the denial theme. We wanted to come to an area that's suffering from low growth because of high taxes. So Illinois has one of the highest tax rates in the country. Their overall tax burden is among the worst in the country. But in recent years, they've increased taxes, the income tax, 67%, I think?
67% on individuals, 46% on business, a grand total of $7 billion, and we still have a problem.
And so, I think the evidence speaks for itself. So I don't need to sit up here and act like I'm the smartest economist in the world, because I'm not. All we need to do is look at the data that come from the BEA and from the IRS, and especially data where people move. People are moving out of Illinois at very high rates because they don't think that the policies in the state are working for them. So they're going to places like Texas, they're going to places like Indiana. The highest out-migration for Illinois, for Texas, the highest in-migration for Texas came from states like Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio.
You're welcome.
Yeah, but it's kind of sad for me. I'm from Ohio myself, and I've often wondered why more of my own peers don't stay there. And in Ohio, it's another state that until recent times has been in denial about tax policy as well. And it's had a very uncompetitive tax policy, and has been setting, literally over the last decade, Ohio lost 315,000 people to other states. And look at the flip side. Texas, a state with no personal income tax, gained 400,000.
That's pretty stunning. And of course, Kristina Rasmussen, you're our executive vice president, and you really run the joint on a day-to-day basis, as everybody around us knows. And you're in Springfield. You live in Springfield, and you chose to live in Springfield when you came here from the National Taxpayers Union in Washington, D.C. You're familiar with the fact that we're often told that people are moving to Texas and Florida from Illinois because it's the weather. But we know that actually Illinois loses population to every single one of our neighboring states. And we lose population to 43 of the other 49 states. And I think Amity mentioned today, as well as in her op-ed in the Tribune. How many of you read Amity's op-ed in the Tribune today? Well, that is not yet enough. The Tribune, as you know, is trying to come out of bankruptcy. So I'd like all of you to go out and buy the paper and turn to the editorial page and help out Amity and us, as well as the Tribune company, because they are an employer, and God knows we need their tax revenue. What is going on in Springfield? Are you drinking the water down there, or can you explain
No,
what
I've got
happens
my
down there?
bottled water.
Well, before she starts, though, I do have to tell you one thing. Kristina, in January of 2011, had identical twin girl babies who are the most adorable little girls you've ever seen besides mine. And she was literally in the maternity ward texting as the tax hike fight was going down to the wire until finally the nurse said, "Put that thing away, you're going to have a baby now."
2 babies.
2 babies, right. Kristina,
Yeah, that's
tell us
right.
what's...
I tease my colleagues that the tax hike didn't happen on my watch because I was otherwise occupied at the time. I got my start with the Illinois Policy Institute in 2009. I moved to Springfield because I thought it would be a great place to raise a family coming from inner city Washington, D.C. And I got there, and it was just as Governor Quinn, newly in office, was talking about a massive income tax increase and thought, this is an awful idea. It's the last thing that Illinois needs right now. We're in the middle of a recession. We shouldn't make it more expensive for people to raise a family and grow a business here. Now, the tax hike didn't go anywhere in 2009. It didn't go anywhere in 2010, but of course, it did ultimately pass in 2011, and it grew. It went from 50% up to 66%. Now, the deal at that time with the tax hike was that it was going to be temporary, and they would partially repeal it in 2015. So the rate we have today is higher, obviously, than what we had before, but perhaps even more important than the absolute rate that we have is the direction people think we're heading. A promise was made to taxpayers that that tax hike would be temporary. It would fix the problems and we'd move on. But if you look at the way that they're spending money, at the rate that they're spending money, it's going to be very hard to repeal that tax hike as promised in 2015. So people are making bets right now about where they think the tax regime in this state is going. And they're not too optimistic if you look at the numbers.
Wasn't there a business that recently actually had a better deal in terms of crony capitalism to stay in Illinois, but they actually chose to go to Iowa?
Yeah, this is actually another good reason to read the Tribune. The editorial board told this story very well. There is an Egyptian billionaire who has ties to Illinois and wanted to build a fertilizer plant in the Midwest to take advantage of the natural gas boom. Well, he was looking at Illinois. He had ties here, educational ties with the university, and he received offers, as he tells it, from both Iowa and Illinois. And Illinois' deal was actually sweeter. The tax incentives they were offering were pretty great. But he ultimately decided to locate that plant in Iowa because he could see ahead. He could see the unfunded pension liabilities ballooning and no action being taken really to bring those underneath control. So he made a bet that even though the upfront deal was better, the long-term stability of Iowa was a better deal for his company. And it's a shame because those are jobs that our friends and family throughout Illinois can't benefit from because they're in Iowa.
I think that's a great example of the challenge that Illinois faces because of the trend line. Now, Ted, you study this every day. Ted Dabrowski is our Vice President of Policy. We had hoped that Dr. McQuillan would be with us today, but he had something come up and it was just unavoidable for him not to be here today. But Ted is an expert on the budget as well as the similar things that Lawrence would have talked about. And you deal with this every day, running our policy shop. Tell us a little bit about what's going on from a policy point of view in tax policy and why you think Illinois needs to change its course to follow the innovators that Matt talked about versus, let me put it to you this way. If you're going to cheat on the test, cheat from the people passing the test, why do we keep setting the grade curve at the bottom? What can we do about that?
Well, we're trying to show, Illinois is trying to show everybody how not to do things. That's been basically the lesson
So we're winning
far.
on that.
We're winning. We're number one. And unfortunately, you look at most of the statistics on growth and a lot of the parameters that we use to measure how successful a state economy is, and we're at the bottom of most lists. And I'd say that the problem has become that we've got this culture. It's a culture that's been going on for a while, but definitely in the last decade. We talk about it a lot as a culture of deficits. And we have found a way to overpromise and continuously overspend. And so the only way to keep covering those shortfalls is through more borrowing and more taxes. And so that's why this mentality in Illinois has been, let's keep promising, we'll figure out the money later, we won't fund the pensions, we'll have record tax increases, and we've gotten ourselves in a bit of a hole. And it's interesting, but you hear now the new problem is, well, $7 billion in new taxes last year wasn't enough. Now we need a progressive tax increase, a progressive tax system. We've had a flat tax in Illinois. It's part of the Constitution. But if you listen to other people, they say it's time to change that Constitution and let's get more money and let's hit the rich guys again. So it's a sad state of affairs. The starting point is that we have had a situation with our pensions where over time, over the last decade or so, we've been giving away more and more in benefits. The legislature has not funded the pensions, and we've got this massive, at the state level only, ignoring the problems of Chicago, it's about $51,000 a household. I tweeted the other day, I'm new to Twitter, it's one of my first real tweets, but I said, how does a person get rid of $51,000 in debt without going to jail and without having your credit score totally destroyed? And the answer was pack up and move out of Illinois. And that's really not the right way to get rid of debt, right? But that's the sad reality. People vote with their feet. The question is going to be whether we can finally realize the problems that we have in Illinois and turn around this tax regime of higher and higher taxes, more and more spending, and more and more borrowing. And I think at some point we're going to reach that point. We haven't reached it yet, but Rhode Island was a good example of where they saw the writing on the wall and they turned things around.
Well, that's an interesting point because, of course, it was a Democratic treasurer of Rhode Island who really took the leadership there, a Democratic legislature and an independent governor, former Republican, but nevertheless sort of a left-leaning former Republican. And then you had the votes in San Jose and San Diego where mostly Democratic constituents and advocates reformed the pensions there. Tell everybody a little bit about the spectacle that occurred with Governor Quinn, whose biggest political benefactors were the employee unions here in Illinois. The government unions, 71% of their money in Illinois goes to the Democratic Party, 29% to the Republican Party. Nationwide, government unions donate about 97% to the Democratic Party. Everybody thought this crisis of pensions in the public sector, consumption of revenue that's thrown off by slow growth economies was going to be just the unions and government workers against Republicans like Scott Walker. We're seeing here in Chicago that now that fight is against a Democratic mayor. We see in California and Rhode Island now that it's about Democrats. Why is that, Ted? Why is this becoming a nonpartisan issue?
Okay, I think in the end it's the math. And I love how in Rhode Island they started talking about the math. As John mentioned, Rhode Island is a Democrat-controlled state. But in a Democrat-controlled state, the math finally hit them. They realized that, and this is for a lot of the Democrats, they realized that the programs they love most, education, healthcare, roads, were at real risk if they had to keep funding pensions in the same way they were expected to from a statutory perspective. They realized that, and they turned around things. They said, we cannot continue in this path, and they did huge reforms, the biggest reforms in the nation. It's funny, though, but in Chicago, we've got a situation where the Chicago public school system will be $1 billion short next year. They've had a pension holiday, which allowed them to avoid funding the pension fully for the last 3 years, and that holiday is ending. And yet, with all those deficits, this government has agreed to higher salaries, has not cut back the spending. And so what's finally going to happen is that even Democrats here in Illinois are going to realize that that can't continue. The math will not work, and something's going to have to give. And so we're finally starting to see for the first time a bifurcation between the unions and the Democrats they support and the Democrats themselves. There's a wedge being driven between them, and we're hoping soon that wedge will be enough to bring around reforms.
Professor Hicks, in the studies that you've done in the state of Indiana and then looking around the country, one of the things I think is interesting is New Hampshire, that is one of the no income tax states, but they also don't have a sales tax. I'm often asked, how do governments without an income tax pay for things? Have you looked into that at all and studied that at all?
The answer is pretty easy with a property tax. And generally economists give a very clear answer that a broad tax with low rates works. Lower the incentive effect of taxation is nonlinear. Most of us wouldn't care about a penny tax on a piece of gum. 50% tax is going to have some effect on our behavior, and so it's not a linear response throughout that. Well, I will say something, though, that sort of goes to the point about states that have an absence of an income tax or playing with an income tax, because that's something that is so volatile with respect to a business cycle that we've just been through, and that's the problem with tax incentives. And so tax incentives, if we see, and I know Amity wrote about that today, Michigan has just gone through a very painful paroxysm with tax incentives. Starting in 1995 through the most recent governor instituted a mega tax incentive that gave out at one point $1.8 billion in a year to businesses to locate to Michigan. And a number of studies of this have been especially damning, some that I've offered, studies with the Mackinac Center, studies that the Michigan Education Association, of all people, analyzed, said that these things were crazy. We found that the tax incentive created no net new jobs in the manufacturing or warehousing sectors where they were targeted. They did create jobs, however, in construction, But again, they cost about $125,000 a job. I was stunned by that number in 2005. And little would I know that 10 years later, after the stimulus, that would be twice as effective as the stimulus program. I mean, the tax incentives that you've heard talk about are really almost a prima facie evidence of a tax system that's not working. That the people who are on the ground, the economic development folks, are interacting with businesses who are crying about tax incentives or tax rates, and their mobility is possible. And so, a Walmart's not going to cry. They're not mobile. They're going to go where the people are. Manufacturing firms and warehousing firms are footloose, and those are the first canary in the coal mine with respect to tax rates. And so those are the ones that are getting the crony capitalism. And if they're not choosing you after those, that's an extraordinary sign of difficulty in a tax system.
So Matthew, in looking at the work, Ohio, New York, Texas, and here you are in Illinois, and you've studied all these competitive environments, what would be your recommendations? Have you thought through what a simple agenda would be? Because it seems to me one of the things that was interesting about Amity's piece today, and in general the idea of tax incentives, is governors are all competing. They've become the recruiter-in-chief of businesses, and they use these various incentive programs to try to recruit businesses. But what we're saying is it's beneficial to lower rates overall, make the playing field level. But that's not politically expedient for governors. How can they kind of blend that? Have you looked into that at all? Governors that play the game by just lowering overall rates rather than wheeling and dealing for the favored few?
Right, and I would add too, another problem with tax incentives is the uncertainty that it creates. Businesses, even if they can get a special deal, it's not a great environment for them to be operating in, because when they move to that area, they don't know if their deal is going to be up in 4 years when this governor leaves or when this key legislator leaves as well. But to get more to your question about what can states do, I think we should just look at what states are doing. Kansas, Governor Sam Brownback, who was highlighted at our conference in April, he was there telling us he was going to lower Kansas's income tax rate from 6.45% to 4.9%, and he followed through. They just recently did that, and they got rid of the corporate tax on almost all small businesses. And so now that's created competition within the Midwest region. So now there's a ballot initiative in Missouri to try to eliminate the income tax for citizens there this fall. We'll see if that's successful. Oklahoma, Governor Mary Fallin, who was also at our conference in April, now, has talked openly that, we need to step up to the plate because places like Kansas are setting the bar higher. And what she's saying is we don't want to be stuck as in Oklahoma as the state between Kansas, Missouri, and Texas that could all, in future years not have an income tax at all. So I think what we're seeing is these states trying to kind of make incremental downgrades in their income tax and phase them out. And generally the policies look like they're trying to do it over something like a 10-year window.
Mm-hmm. So Kristina, tell everybody here why we should be optimistic. One of the things we do at the Institute is tell the truth about the current situation. One of the things we like to talk about is before you can launch a new paradigm, you have to destroy loyalty to the current paradigm. One of the things we're trying to do is destroy loyalty to the crony capitalists, the insider deal making that is the economic cesspool of Illinois and Chicago, so that we can launch a new period of, that's a lot there, think about that. This all used to be a cesspool, literally, right here, in fact. But tell us why we should be optimistic. One of the things that we see, the underlying data, is that the public is moving towards our point of view in terms of liberty, free markets, and unfettered economic competition. But it's not obvious to the general public, and many people are discouraged. Give us hope.
Yeah. Even if you have an electorate that is naturally inclined towards what we would call big government solutions, if they see those solutions failing year after year after year, it begins to erode the loyalty to those ideas just because it hits close to home when your husband can't get a job, when your wife can't get a job, your mom, your sister, your brother, whoever it is. And one of the exciting things that we try to do at the Illinois Policy Institute is be down there in Springfield and try to counter some of the message that is just asking for more big government solutions. I love personally going into a committee room and seeing 10 advocates of a big government lined up, and then there's me with the free market solutions. And you see people beginning to open their mind to a different way forward just because we have right now is so broken. I mean, you saw Medicaid reforms move earlier this year. We would have liked them to go further, but there was some good stuff in there. And similarly, you even see Democrats starting to talk about pension reform because, as Ted said, the writing is on the wall. So our role really is to be there with good ideas. Just by way of example, example, every year the governor puts out his budget in the spring. Well, we take up the challenge of trying to balance the budget without a tax increase, rolling back that tax increase, and creating a state that's friendly to entrepreneurs. And we do that with policy solutions, line by line item proposals, just trying to give hope to people that there's a new way forward and there's different ideas out there. And of course, countering the bad ones when they're there, like the progressive income tax, which is something you all should be very aware of.
Ted, the whole discussion here is about tax denial and survivability. You've had a unique life experience, having been in Mexico and in Warsaw. Why don't you tell everybody about that and your experience with how a free market is born, even in a former Eastern Bloc country, and why that should give us hope here in Illinois?
Okay, so I had the opportunity to be in Poland for almost 9 years, from 1998 until 2007. And what was interesting there was how things changed, right? You had a country that was trampled on for 50 years under communism. The mentality, though the Polish fought very hard, the mentality was trampled on. And what was interesting is that, of course, I was there a few years after the wall went down. But what we saw was this transition, this desire by all the people to move towards a Western society and to get rid of government intervention, government ownership of companies. And what was most interesting about that was how the people changed the leadership. A lot of the leaders who were leaders in the early 90s were ex-communists. You know, these were the same ex-communists who were making bad deals and in a lot of the crony capitalism and just the way that the communist world worked. But the people held accountable these new leaders, these new ex-Democrats who are now ex-communists who are now social democrats, to a higher principle about ridding government involvement in state lives. And I loved being there. I loved being there at a time where they had to change thousands of laws. Imagine how many laws they had to change. They had to make their tax regime competitive. They went to a flat tax. They did all of the pension reforms, all those things that we'd love to see in Illinois. It's kind of funny. I was there watching a transformation of Poland go from left to right, but I came to Illinois 5 years ago and watched everything go from right to left. So it's a funny transition, but I'm optimistic because once the people figure out what they want, and we've said we're a little confused here in Illinois, but once we educate and convince the people of what they really want, they will hold those leaders accountable, and they will make it politically profitable for bad leaders to do the right things. And that's the point we need to reach to, and I think that's why we're optimistic. We think we can get there.
Yeah, one of the things we like to say is that public policy passes through a political process. So the Declaration and, of course, the Constitution are public policy documents. It passed through initially a political process prior to the Revolution. The Declaration and then, of course, the Constitution in 1787. And in order for that to happen, you have to have the public lead. Our view of it is that with some exceptions, and there are some of those exceptions in this room today, most political leaders wait for the parade to form before they want to get in front of the parade. There are a few political leaders, such as Governor Walker, Governor Daniels, and others, who will get out front and say, here's the parade that I would like to form, join me. And I think that one of the reasons we know that we're on the right track is because of the reactions of the people in control in Springfield and here. Governor Quinn, Speaker Madigan, Senate President Cullerton, all of them are talking about reform now because they're reading the same polls we are, which is the public is moving towards wanting a solution and accountability, and the public is also starting to understand that the government union sector is the driver of the consumption of the limited tax dollars in a slow growth economy. We're going to go to questions in just a couple of minutes, so prepare yourself for questions, and somebody will be around with a microphone in a couple of minutes for your questions to get you engaged in this discussion and to find out what you would like to ask of our expert panel. Matt, what would you say is going to happen in Ohio? Ohio is an interesting state. It's unlike Illinois, it is considered a swing state, a battleground state. You have a governor there that is trying to put in more free market reforms. How's he doing in Ohio, and how do you think that's going to play out? Is Ohio improving from where it was?
Ohio's certainly improved. Actually, their unemployment rate is lower than the national average. It's in the 7% instead of the 8%. Governor Kasich was elected in 2010, and as you said, he immediately tried to start instituting some reforms that could really help the state. He managed to pass a bill that was hugely controversial. I had moved from Ohio at the time, but I was still hearing all about this from all of my friends, called Senate Bill 5, and what it did was strip. It was less ambitious than some people tried to make it sound. It really wasn't the boogeyman, but what it tried to do was limit some collective bargaining of public sector employees, public sector unions. And it was passed, went through the legislature, and then unfortunately the next year by ballot referendum it was removed. So some of the progress gained from that unfortunately has gone backwards. But I think the lesson from that is Ohio is just a very moderate state. As we see every 4 years, when there's a presidential election, they sort of trample through Ohio, very vigorously because it is such a swing state and it really can go either way. So I think it'll be interesting to see which way it goes in this presidential election. I couldn't tell you any better than the polls do right now, but Ohio, I think while it's made some gains and it's managed to balance its budget, unlike states like Illinois, it still has quite a ways to go.
Professor Hicks, who are some of the winners right now in the country? Who's winning this battle for economic competition among the 50 states, and who is losing? We have the 9 states that don't have an income tax. Certainly you can mention those, but any others that may have an income tax but are making improvements that you think their competitive position is improving?
Right. I think, well, Tennessee doesn't have an income tax. I think they're doing extraordinarily well. Obviously, Indiana. I would say from an economic standpoint, we've talked about Texas. Obviously, some of those great square states out in the Midwest that are booming from shale are making a big difference. I mean, I think it's easier to see also in a state level how individual cities within states are doing very well. One of the things I like to do that my wife detests is look at border effects. So when I drive if we're on vacation, she loves this. I say, could we just drive, look at the tax borders in a couple of places? And you can actually see.
That's exciting, honey. Let's do that now.
You can go with us.
I can't wait.
So actually, the border effects in states, if you look between South and North Carolina, for example, Virginia and Maryland is just a classic example. Matt and I talked about it last night. I grew up in both those states, and if you look at the border effects and the type of commerce that are appearing on either side, that gives you a sense of what's happening. But right now it's a very difficult time to take an immediate assessment of tax policy because some of these things take years to materialize. I mean, Indiana, for example, didn't have the migration in the first half of the last decade. We were bleeding people off as fast as Illinois was. In the second half of the decade, that slowed a little bit. We actually turned the corner in 2011, saw a net population increase for the first time in a couple of decades. And so I think when you think about what states are doing well, you see which cities are doing well. You can have a state that's doing well and have a city that's just suffering greatly in terms of the quality of its public schools and overall local tax burden as well. We haven't talked about that, but the capacity for local governments to tax themselves out of existence exists even in great places like Indiana.
Well, and it certainly is happening in Chicago. Chicago's population is now, Amity talked earlier about what a great growth city Chicago was in the late 1890s, and our population is now equivalent to the 1920s, to give you some perspective. 200,000 African Americans moved out of the city between the 2000 and 2010 census, in my view, because the public services, primarily education, were no longer meeting their needs and they had to go elsewhere. So tax competition matters, and you cannot deny the truth, and people will move for survival. And let's make sure this panel survives by having some questions from all of you. So I believe there are some people with microphones. Who has the microphones? Could you sort of raise your hands? Come on up. And I don't know if you have a place you're going right away, but anybody that would like to ask a question, raise your hand. And the microphone folks will get to you. Jane, I see one right up front. I can't quite see who it is, but she'll work her way over to you. And if you could just state your name and your question, and please not a dissertation. Professor.
My name is Lee Morris, and I'd like to ask, in Indiana, we put property tax caps in the Constitution of the state of Indiana. Is that good tax policy?
Excellent question. Professor?
I personally detest frittering about with state constitutions, but if you're looking to remove uncertainty, and this was a referendum process, the state certainly did that. And I'll say, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Indiana tax policy, there was a taxpayers' revolt. And the places where you can still see the remnants of that is to drive across tax bordering locations in such places as Muncie or in Lake to Porter County in this metropolitan statistical area, where tax rates varied by 4 or 5 percentage points in effective property tax rates on a similar piece of property. And so in terms of mitigating the uncertainty that certainly is penalizing a state's commerce, imposing tax caps into a constitution makes a difference.
Next question. Jen, you have one right on your left. I believe that's Mr. Costello.
Bob Costello. How do we get out of this pension mess in Illinois? I mean, the unfunded liability. I mean, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel there? And what's the roadmap?
Ted, why don't you take that one?
Okay, so the unfunded liabilities in Illinois continue to go up as we learn more and more about how states and localities account for them. As we get more and more transparency, we realize, for example, in the state of Illinois, we've talked about $83 billion as the unfunded liability for the 5 state pension systems. The reality is Moody's, S&P, the governmental standards for GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board, they're all coming out with new and appropriate ways of measuring the pension debt. And so the pension debt in Illinois for the 5 state systems is not $83 billion, it's over $200 billion. And I think that's the realization we're starting to come to. If we hope that by this new transparency, the reforms that are going to be required have to be much larger. You know, I like to say that, for a small problem you need a shovel, but for a big problem you need a big backhoe. And we need to pull out a much bigger solution set for Illinois. Unfortunately, I think the first set of reforms are going to be probably kicking the can down the road. Maybe sometime late this year, early next year, we'll get some amount of reforms. They won't be the right ones. And I think only as we start to realize that the problems are bigger will we finally move to what I would say are the defined contribution 401k type reforms. That's the only one that's going to end the politicians keeping their hands in the cookie jar in terms of being able to fund or not fund the pension system, stop them from changing the terms of the benefits, and really the end goal is to have each individual, a public sector individual, control their own pension, have a transparent system like the 401k that they own, they control, and that politicians can't mess with. I think it's going to take a bit for us to hit that realization. I hope that the math sends us to some decent amount of reforms, but it might take a while before we get to that 401k solution. Rahm Emanuel, a year ago, recommended at least as part of the solution a 401k system. So he sees it. I think what we've seen in the last few months is that the legislature is not ready for that yet. But we're hoping that with the pressures that are coming on, when you look at the Chicago strike, when you look at the problems that the Chicago pension system are going to have, the reality is going to be that we need to move to something bold, much bolder than what Rhode Island did. And I'm confident we can get there, but it's going to take a lot of education and communication.
Let me add something to that on the political side. So Ted talked a little bit about the policy solution, essentially with stripping it down to its simplicity, 401k transference, whatever you've earned, you vest, you keep, and then a date specific going forward for current employees, you go to a 401k. But where's this is ultimately a political solution. The political solution will come to the forefront at the time when to be blunt about it, the coalition of the Democratic Party, because they are in control currently, begins to have a wedge driven between it for fighting for state resources. So right now you have the public sector unions at the table fighting for state resources, and then you have all the people that provide services in the healthcare arena through Medicaid and health services through state, services to the poor and disadvantaged, and public education. So all the advocates, the true believing advocates who want to see more funding for those services for government are beginning already to see the unions as their enemy, because it's like a Pac-Man. For those of you who are old enough to remember the game Pac-Man, the pension debt and the public sector consumption of state resources is now swallowing a greater and greater slice of the pie that Amity referred to. And so what's happening for the first time in this last budget cycle is budgets were actually cut in the core services area for the first time. And what that means is the reality is now setting in upon those people who are advocates on the left, and they realize now that their union friends that they've been friends with for so long, when you had high growth and revenue was being thrown off sufficient to fund both sides of that equation, they are now threatened. And once that starts to fray politically, there'll be an opening for the party on the other side, Republicans, to partner and negotiate a solution that I think we'll get to sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. Next question, Craig Mansky, right there next to Jane.
What, if anything, could have Ohio done to convince the public of the need for collective bargaining reform?
Their biggest resistance came from the teachers' unions, which is
Shocked.
a familiar story here in Chicago. And so, I think it was really shocking for me even to see some of my former teachers striking in front of the local courthouse. So I think that's where they kind of lost their public relations battle was with the teachers' unions, because people, I think people associate positively with their teachers. People think fondly of their teachers, and so do the parents. They know the teachers. They don't necessarily know the governor sitting in Columbus, in the case of Ohio, who's talking about pension reform, and they think, maybe the teachers have a good argument here. But I think it's similar across the country. It's just these pensions are ballooning. It's being driven by the public sector unions. The private sector unions are, across the country are really at an all-time low. It's the public sector unions that are still so high. And so something that Indiana did, when Mitch Daniels first came, was he just outlawed public sector unions. And you've seen from the budget perspective the influence of that.
Well, if it was that easy, I'll just wave the wand. Let's do that here. It's easier in Indiana than it is in Illinois for a host of reasons. We have a question right up here, Mr. Stewart. Then we'll go to the back. After this question, we'll move to the back.
You've mentioned that for states to limit the ability to raise taxes is maybe not a good idea. Have any states or local governments gone to a pay-as-you-go requirement, a constitutional amendment, if you will, and require these pensions and states and local governments to pay as you go?
Professor?
I can take a shot at that. The state constitutions almost exclusively require a pay-as-you-go or a balanced budget requirement. I think Vermont is the only one that does not explicitly do so. The problem is that it doesn't take a very clever guy to figure out a way around that. And we have not very many clever people who are operating those systems. And so the unfunded liability that we talk about is very simple. I'm a professor in Indiana, so I have a 401k system, right? So the state doesn't manage my retirement funds, and I'm thankful for that. But in Illinois, my colleagues and good friends here in the state system, the finance professors don't think their pension requirements have any value. They know that they can't retire on the date that they would like to retire. They know that, the realists, my colleagues, they know that the amount of money that they're promised is unrealistic. So the unfunded liabilities are really the promises made to individuals. And what is most ironic about this is that even the federal government, I'm also a military retiree, the federal government actually is taking steps for military retirees to not have a fully defined contribution plan, but a defined, or not a defined benefit plan, but a joint plan. And this is ironic because the federal government could print the money to pay for us military retirees. Illinois cannot. And so I think that's where the real problem is the pay-as-you-go is easy to be kicked down the can because you have an unfunded liability that is going to be fixed by the Government Accounting Standards Board over the next 2 or 3 years, which is going to explode across the country. That's the next big explosive change.
And this is the point of my, by transferring the payment out to future generations, that's not pay as you go. And we all know that a lot of private pension funds are fully funded, and you could cut them off today and they would pay out everybody, and that's pay as you go. Transferring the payments to future generations, my children and my grandchildren, is not pay as you go.
And that's going to change with new Government Accounting Standard Board rules.
Yeah, the point he's making, in answer to your question, Fred, is that the rules are changing to force what you're asking for, whereas the rules were flexible and undefined previously, which allowed politicians to play with the numbers of the discount rate and what we call the ramp on the pension and push it off. It's sort of like in your own retirement, you're in your 20s and you say, well, I'm not going to start saving for my retirement until I'm in my 50s. So then in your 50s, you have a giant ramp to save over your last 10 years before you retire. It would have been much easier to have had a nice, slow, steady ramp when you start in your 20s. We've been doing the push off, and we have a giant ramp now. And the laws that he's talking about with GASB and others are going to force all the public pension systems to be honest about it and pay as you go. Let's go to the back, actually, and I'll come right back to you in a second. I promised it in the back.
I'm Jerry Hayden, a member of IPI. Since the Chicago Public Schools are so much of a failure, and over 40% of the students do not graduate, and most of the ones who do graduate really don't deserve to graduate. A lot of the charter schools are doing very well, as is homeschooling all around the country. Why don't we let this strike go on? Let's have our mayor have a little backbone here, and the pressure will be more and more on getting the kids educated. And let's start getting more charter schools going and getting more homeschooling going and gradually force the teachers who are not getting paychecks regularly, they'll still want to teach, we start hiring the ones who want to teach in the charter schools and solve this problem. This might take a while, and it'll be a little problem with the people we have in government now. But what do you think of that idea?
We'll have Kristina. Yes, feel free. We'll have Kristina address that question, but I want to point out that Jerry has perfectly illustrated why, in my view, the CTU did not approve the contract on Sunday as was expected, because it's dawned on them that the mayor is going to do exactly what Jerry just described. Kristina, you want to take that?
Yeah, Jerry, you're right. By any standard of grading, a 60% pass rate for Chicago Public High School students is a failing grade. We know we can do better. You look at the data with charter schools, that when you give Chicago kids a chance to go to a quality school where the incentives are different and the opportunity for learning is just completely reset from what's in our public schools right now, they can learn if given a chance. And so why this is such an amazing opportunity now to be talking about alternatives for Chicago public schools. What we've known for the past 25 years is not what we're going to know for the next 25 years. You know, a lot of kids were in school over the past few weeks. They were in private schools and charter schools. So state legislators who often set the policy for what's allowed via the charter cap, opportunity scholarship vouchers, online blended learning, they need to step up to the plate should the strike end within the next few days and begin to open some of those paths forward so that we have more kids in private schools, we have more kids in high-performing charter schools. Online learning becomes more a part of the conversation. There's an amazing opportunity here, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, the bottom line on this strike is that the teachers union, which I believe is the Chicago Teachers Union, which I believe is the most radicalized public employee union in the country, right? They voted 90% to strike. They are trying to avoid accountability, and accountability is what would happen with what Jerry described. Ambassador Glassman, you had a question. Jane, if you could come and give him the microphone.
Thank you. And thanks for a great discussion. I just am wondering, what are the lessons for federal tax policy from the states? Specifically, Matt talked about the 9 states that don't have a personal income tax. They do raise money, in almost all cases, from a sales tax, a consumption tax, as well as from a wealth tax, a property tax. So is that an important lesson for the federal government?
Go ahead. Anybody want to take that? Or?
I can take a quick shot at it. I mean, I think most states are going to say we prefer a federalist approach, a state that has remedied its internal problems, that we don't need to filter our tax dollars through a federal organization for energy or for education or for any of the other programs that we're willing to, I'm sorry, there are some people here who may disagree with me, but those tax dollars can be used at home without being filtered. So I think essentially the first step would be is to eliminate some of the pure transfers from intergovernmental transfers that extract wealth from a local or state region, take it to the federal government, then redistribute it 80, 95% back to where it came from after the share has been removed for governmental processing. And so the overall tax system now is more progressive than it has been. The U.S. federal tax system, it's a fairly progressive tax system. I don't think most states are very worried about the federal tax rate system. It's the amount of extracted wealth that they're concerned about because it limits their capacity to make good decisions about what they want to do in states.
Yeah, I think the lesson for federal policymakers is to look at the states and see that they're engaged in these tax competitions. So states that don't want to play in the competition are losing. And so that's something the U.S. government can learn. So they think perhaps that it's great that, you know, they don't have to worry about competing with the states because they're the federal government. They're competing with other countries. And there's evidence that they're in denial about that too. We have the highest corporate income tax of any major industrialized country in the world. We're looking at the fiscal cliff where income tax, almost every category of tax that was lowered in the early 2000s under President Bush will expire. And so we're all sort of also worried about uncertainty about what's going to happen there. So I think that the lesson for federal lawmakers is that they need to be looking at ways to be more efficient, and also be more competitive. One really interesting idea, which was raised at our conference in April, came from Kevin Hassett, a very esteemed economist at the American Enterprise Institute. And he said, well, why don't we just return to the Constitution, which says the federal government should figure out how much money it needs, then it should send the bill to the states, and we'll let the states decide how to raise this money. And then you can imagine we'd see 50 different ideas about what's the best way to raise the amount of money that the federal government says we should send. So we're all kind of pushing Dr. Hassett to explore more on that topic, but that's something that I at least think is very interesting, at least.
One of the insidious natures of the way this works with all the federal money, all the state money flowing to the federal government is if you look at the total budgets of states, and I haven't looked at this in some years, but some years ago when I did look at this, about 40% or 45% on average of total spending by a state actually comes from the federal government. And of course, that's power. And so the challenge is politically, how do you elect people who are willing to devolve power back to the states as the founders originally envisioned? And that's certainly a question for all of you to think about in the election season as you make your own. Sure.
The other issue I wanted to get at is the method of collecting taxes. In other words, you've got 9 states that have no personal income tax, but they have a consumption tax.
Right.
So is that a lesson for the federal government?
I think that's very interesting. I've always felt that income taxes were a tax on labor and thus a form of servitude. And I think it's also the most visible and unavoidable tax. You can't not conduct labor, and you're going to be taxed. Consumption is voluntary. Your level of consumption is voluntary, and I think much more beneficial. Anybody want to take that, the consumption tax?
There's been some talk of this in Illinois. Right now, the sales tax is primarily on goods here. We don't tax services. Maybe that's why we have a strong service sector in Chicago, because we don't tax them the way we do goods. But there's been talk of expanding the sales tax onto services. Now, theoretically, I think a lot of us would be open to that idea if the resulting revenue was used to lower the rate. That's not going to be the case in Illinois. They'll just grab that money and spend it on things they've already committed to. I think you would see the same happen at the federal government. But to answer your first question, what is the lesson for the federal government, is that it is not the federal government's job to bail out states who engage in bad policy that leads to bad outcomes. Everyone's talking about Illinois' pension problems. They're getting so big. There's even been whispers of, well, could we get federal assistance in some form or another? That's not the federal government's job. If they reward bad behavior and punish those who've been responsible, you destroy our system of fiscal federalism, and that is perhaps one of the most dangerous roads we could go down.
Well, I wish we had time for more questions, but Jim, you yourself have said a fine line on timing. So I'd like to thank our panelists, Ted Dabrowski, Michael Hicks, Kristina Rasmussen, and Matt Denhart.
Thank you, John.